Picture this. You have sold everything you own, said goodbye to your family, and traveled thousands of miles across a vast and unforgiving continent. Your destination is a rugged, sun-scorched landscape in California, a place whispered about in every newspaper and saloon back east. You arrived with a head full of dreams and a heart full of hope, clutching little more than a pickaxe and a pan. But after just a few days, a new, more immediate reality sets in. The glitter of gold dust is quickly overshadowed by a far more basic, gnawing need. Your stomach is empty, your supplies are dwindling, and the nearest real town is a brutal week's journey away. This wasn't just a search for wealth, it was a daily, desperate struggle for survival, and at the very center of that struggle was a single, all-consuming question: what on earth do you eat out here? Welcome to the true story of the California Gold Rush, a chapter of history we think we know, filled with tales of fortunes won and lost. But behind every swing of the hammer and every panning of a river was a human being, powered by a diet that was often as shocking as it was insufficient. We are about to pull back the curtain on one of history's greatest and grimmest feeding frenzies. We'll venture into the makeshift camps and chaotic mining towns to uncover the surprising, the grim, and the downright bizarre reality of what miners actually ate to fuel their impossible dreams. This is a journey into the stomach of the gold rush, a story not just of gold, but of grit, of desperation, and of the extraordinary lengths people will go to for a single, decent meal. So, let's set aside the romanticized visions of nuggets and riches for a moment, and dig into the true fuel of an era that reshaped a nation. To truly grasp the desperation that defined a miner's diet, we have to start at the very beginning, on the trails and seas that led to the Promised Land. The hopeful souls who rushed to California in 1849, forever branded as the 49ers, didn't just face hunger at the diggings. They embarked on a journey that was a test of endurance in itself, and their food was the first thing to be tested. Whether they chose the overland route across the Great Plains and the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains, or the long, perilous sea voyage around Cape Horn, they were traveling for months, not weeks. Every single item of sustenance had to be carefully considered, packed, and preserved to survive the trip. This meant a diet built entirely around one simple, brutal principle: it couldn't spoil. The cornerstone of this travel larder was a substance that was barely food at all: hardtack. This was a simple flour and water biscuit, baked rock hard to drive out all moisture. It was so durable that soldiers and sailors would famously joke about breaking their teeth on it, often dunking it in coffee or water just to make it edible. Paired with this was salt pork, massive cuts of pork heavily cured in salt brine, which could last for astonishingly long periods, but was often so tough and salty it had to be boiled repeatedly just to be palatable. Dried beans, rice, and coffee beans completed this monotonous trinity. The reality of the journey, however, had a way of turning even these basic, durable supplies against the travelers. On wagon trains, barrels of food could be shattered in river crossings, their contents ruined by muddy water. A sudden prairie storm could soak flour sacks, turning them into a solid, inedible mass. The salt pork, if not perfectly sealed, could go rancid under the blistering sun. For those on ships, weevils and other pests often infested the hardtack, adding an unexpected and unwelcome protein to an already meager meal. By the time these weary adventurers finally stumbled into the gold fields of California, their bodies were often weakened, and their carefully hoarded supplies were either gone or so monotonous that the very sight of them was disheartening. They arrived not as well-equipped pioneers, but as hungry, exhausted people stepping into a vacuum. The landscape they entered offered little in the way of natural abundance, and the sheer number of new arrivals instantly created a demand that dwarfed any existing supply. The crisis didn't begin at the riverbank with a pan in hand. It began the moment their journey ended, with an empty stomach and a nearly empty pack, setting the stage for a frantic and often disastrous scramble for something, anything to eat. So you finally arrived. You've survived the months-long journey, pushed your body to its absolute limit, and now you stand at the edge of a bustling mining camp, heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. But that initial hope curdles almost instantly as you take in your new reality. This wasn't a land of milk and honey. It was a landscape of mud, dust, and chaos, and your first, most brutal lesson wouldn't be about how to find gold, but about how to keep from starving in a place where the very concept of value had been turned completely upside down. The most immediate and shocking discovery was the price of everything. The scarcity of goods and the tidal wave of demand from tens of thousands of new arrivals created an economic frenzy that defied all logic from back home. That single egg you might have taken for granted at breakfast could now cost you $1. A simple loaf of bread could set you back $2. To put that in perspective, back in New York, a skilled laborer might earn $1 for an entire day's work. Here, you could spend that in a single, desperate bite. These weren't just expensive groceries. They were prices that felt like a form of madness, a tax on desperation levied by those who saw a greater fortune in feeding miners than in mining for gold themselves. These opportunistic merchants, often the only source of provisions for hundreds of miles, operated with a ruthless understanding of their power. They controlled the supply lines, and they knew a hungry man would pay anything. And so, you found yourself staring at shelves stocked with the very same durable goods you just endured for months: hardtack, salt pork, dried beans, but now at prices that would rapidly drain the meager stake you'd saved for your mining venture. The tragedy, however, went far beyond just the cost. Even if you could muster the courage to part with your precious coins, the quality of what you were buying was often abysmal. Barrels of flour, having spent too long on a damp ship or in a leaky warehouse, were frequently caked solid or alive with weevils. That salt pork you relied on. It was often the cuts that hadn't sold elsewhere, now green around the edges and giving off a foul odor, sold to men too hungry to be picky. Fresh food was a mythical luxury, a rumor whispered among the camps. The absence of fruits and vegetables meant that scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, became a quiet, debilitating epidemic. Men would find their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening, their strength sapped not by hard labor, but by a simple, preventable lack of nutrition. So there you stood at the beginning of your great adventure, already facing an impossible equation. Your body was screaming for real sustenance, but your pocketbook was screaming in protest. You were caught between the rock of exorbitant prices and the hard place of rotten provisions. This was the true initiation into the gold rush, not the first swing of the pick, but the first painful realization that your dream of wealth could be undone by something as basic and humbling as an empty stomach. This profound food shock, this collision of hope with harsh economic reality, set the stage for everything that would follow. It forced a level of ingenuity and a tolerance for hardship that few could have anticipated, transforming the quest for gold into a parallel, daily quest for mere survival. And so, faced with those impossible prices and rotten flour, the miner's diet quickly narrowed to a few brutal essentials, and at the very center of nearly every meal, you would find a single, unshakable staple: salt pork. This wasn't the carefully cured ham or bacon we might think of today. This was a preservation method pushed to its absolute limit, a testament to the grim necessity of simply making food last. The process was straightforward but intense. Large slabs of pork, often from the belly or other fatty cuts, were packed tightly into barrels and completely submerged in a heavy brine, a solution so saturated with salt, it created an environment where bacteria simply couldn't survive. This was the technology of the era, a way to keep protein edible for months on a long sea voyage or in a sweltering mining camp warehouse. But understanding the process doesn't convey the reality of eating it. When a miner finally got his hands on a piece of this preserved pork, what he was confronting was a culinary challenge. The meat was rock hard, its texture more like wood than flesh, and caked with a crust of crystallized salt. It was often so tough that you couldn't simply cut it with a knife. You'd need to hack at it or even use a hammer to break off a piece, and that was before you even tasted it. The flavor was an overwhelming, tongue-puckering wave of salt, a sensation so intense it could make you thirsty for hours. Worse still, if the barrel had been compromised or the meat was old, A rancid, slightly sour undertone would permeate the entire piece, a sign that the preservation was failing but the food was still being sold. Because of this, preparing salt pork was an act of patience and desperation. Before it could even be considered for the cooking pot, a miner had to engage in a long, tedious process of rehydration and desalination. He would take his hacked-off chunk of meat and submerge it in a pot of clean water, letting it soak for hours, sometimes even overnight. He would often have to change the water multiple times, watching it turn cloudy with dissolved salt, slowly leaching the preservative out just to make the meat vaguely palatable. Only after this lengthy ritual could cooking begin, and the methods were as simple as the ingredients. The most common was a basic boil, creating a thin, greasy broth. Into this pot would go the soaked salt pork, along with any other available ingredients, usually the ever-present dried beans or a handful of rice. The result was a monotonous, greasy stew, a single pot meal that provided calories and protein but offered little in the way of taste or variety. This was the fuel, day after day, week after week. The profound lack of freshness in this diet had a devastating, tangible effect on the miners' bodies. Without any access to fruits or vegetables, they were completely deprived of vitamin C, a crucial nutrient the human body cannot produce on its own. The consequence was scurvy, a debilitating and gruesome disease that would slowly creep through the camps. A miner would first notice a strange lethargy, his energy fading even before he started his day's work. Then came the swollen, spongy gums that would bleed at the slightest touch, followed by his teeth becoming loose in their sockets. Old wounds would reopen, and the body's ability to heal itself would simply shut down. It was a cruel irony that these men, who saw themselves as pillars of strength and endurance, could be brought so low not by a rock slide or a fever, but by the simple, absent citrus, fruit, or potato. Their mighty search for fortune was constantly undermined by a body starved of the most basic building blocks of health, all because their primary source of sustenance, the ubiquitous salt pork, could keep them alive but could not keep them well. If salt pork provided the essential, if problematic, protein for the 49er, then the true engine of his day, the starchy ballast that filled his belly and powered his relentless labor, was the humble bean. In a world defined by scarcity and exorbitant cost, the bean was a rare beacon of practical virtue. It was astonishingly cheap, especially when bought in massive, bulk sacks. It was incredibly durable, able to withstand months of storage in a damp canvas tent without spoiling. Most importantly, it was phenomenally filling. A single pot of cooked beans would expand into a voluminous, heavy meal that could quiet the gnawing hunger of a man engaged in 10 to 12 hours of back-breaking physical work, digging, hauling, and panning in icy river water. And from a logistical standpoint, it was the perfect campfire food. Preparation required no special equipment, just a single pot, some water, and a bed of hot coals. A miner could set his bean pot to simmer in the morning before heading out to his claim and return in the evening to a ready-made, hot meal. This convenience, however, came at a steep price to the palate. The diet was one of crushing monotony. Breakfast was often a reheated scoop of beans from the night before. Lunch, if he bothered to stop and eat at all, was a cold portion of those same beans, eaten hastily by the riverbank. Dinner was once again a fresh pot of beans. This cycle repeated day after day, week after week, until the very sight of them could become a source of deep psychological weariness. The bean was not a food, it was a fuel, and the human spirit craves more than just fuel. This desperate need for variety, for any break in the culinary tedium, led to a kind of rough-hewn culinary ingenuity. The most common way to doctor the pot was by adding a chunk of that precious, pre-soaked salt pork, allowing its fatty, salty juices to permeate the beans as they cooked. If a miner was out of pork, a spoonful of saved bacon grease would serve a similar purpose, adding a smoky richness and crucial fat calories. On a very good day, a lucky forager might add a wild onion or a handful of edible greens scavenged from the hillsides, a rare burst of freshness that would be talked about for days. But these were fleeting luxuries. The overwhelming reality was a thick, starchy pottage, its flavor profile swinging between bland and brutally salty. A culinary Groundhog Day that mirrored the repetitive, hope-driven cycle of the mining life itself. This was the sustenance that built California, not with flavor or finesse, but with sheer, stubborn bulk, providing the caloric foundation for an entire generation of dreamers, one identical, simmering pot at a time. But while salt pork and beans formed the savory core of a miner's diet, the true test of his resolve often came in the form of his bread, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. In a world without bakeries, without reliable ovens, and with flour that was often too spoiled or expensive to use for proper baking, miners turned to a survival ration with a legendary and infamous reputation: hardtack. Imagine a simple mixture of flour and water, but mixed into a stiff dough and then baked not once, but multiple times, until every last drop of moisture was driven out. The result was a rectangular biscuit as hard as a slate shingle and nearly as durable. This was not food designed for pleasure, it was engineered for survival, a calorie-dense brick that could withstand being tossed in a sack, jostled in a wagon for months, or even survive a fall into a river, emerging perfectly intact and just as inedible as it was before. The first challenge was simply getting your teeth into it. A fresh piece of hardtack was famously capable of cracking a tooth, and miners quickly learned that biting directly into it was an act of foolish bravery. Instead, they developed a whole repertoire of methods to transform this rock-like substance into something they could actually swallow. The most common technique was a good, long soak. A miner would drop a piece of hardtack into his morning coffee or a cup of water, letting it sit for several minutes until the outer layer softened into a pasty, gruel-like consistency. While this made it chewable, it also created a bland, soggy mush that did little to lift the spirits. For a more substantial and vastly more appealing meal, they would turn to frying. They'd take these soaked biscuits and sizzle them in a pan with precious bacon grease or pork fat, creating a dish known as skilligali. This transformed the bland cracker into a greasy, crispy, and desperately needed calorie bomb, a rare moment of culinary satisfaction in an otherwise bleak landscape. Yet even this simple comfort came with its own hidden horrors, because hardtack was stored for so long, often in damp, unsanitary conditions. It was a perfect breeding ground for pests. It was commonplace for a miner to break a piece of hardtack in half only to find it was not solid, but hollowed out, a labyrinth of tiny tunnels woven through the center by weevils and other insects. Some men would tap their biscuits sharply on the table to try and dislodge the inhabitants before eating, but many, too weary, hungry, or simply resigned to their fate, would just shrug and eat it anyway, joking darkly that the weevils were just a bit of extra pepper and salt for their meal. In that grim humor lies a profound truth about the gold rush experience. Hardtack was more than just a cracker, it was a symbol of the entire endeavor. It was durable, yes, but it was also brutally hard, infested with unexpected problems, and required immense effort just to make it barely tolerable. A miner's relationship with this simple flour and water biscuit mirrored his relationship with the gold fields themselves, a daily exercise in endurance, ingenuity, and the acceptance of conditions that would have been unthinkable back home. Of course, the relentless monotony of salt pork and beans created a powerful, almost primal craving for something different, something fresh, and in this landscape devoid of grocery stores, that meant turning to the land itself. Hunting wasn't a hobby or a sport for the 49ers. It was a vital, often desperate necessity, a way to inject real flavor and crucial nutrition into a diet that was slowly sapping their vitality. The most commonly pursued game were the animals that populated the foothills and valleys in great numbers. Vast herds of mule deer roamed the region, and a successful hunt for a single deer could provide a camp with fresh meat for days, a glorious windfall that felt like a king's feast. Smaller, more readily available creatures like jackrabbits and squirrels became frequent targets. A jackrabbit, while lean and stringy, could be stewed into a rich, gamey broth that was a world away from the greasy salt pork pot. Squirrel, often cooked over an open flame, offered a few precious bites of delicate, lean meat, These smaller kills were the everyday victories, the reliable supplements that could break the soul-crushing cycle of preserved rations. But the wilderness of Gold Rush, California was a far wilder place than it is today, and it held much larger, much more dangerous opportunities. The most formidable and sought-after prize was the California grizzly bear, a massive subspecies that is now sadly extinct. A single grizzly could yield hundreds of pounds of meat and, just as importantly, vast quantities of rich, precious fat, a commodity as valuable as gold for men living on lean, preserved diets. The bear's fat could be rendered into lard for cooking, used to waterproof leather boots, or simply eaten for its dense calories. But this was no simple hunt. Pursuing a grizzly was an incredibly dangerous undertaking that required immense courage, skill, and a heavy caliber rifle. A wounded bear could easily turn the tables on a hunting party, and more than one miner met his end not in a mine shaft, but under the claws of the very creature he hoped would feed his camp for a month. This highlights the fundamental problem with relying on hunting. It was an unreliable and deeply unequal source of sustenance. Not every man who arrived in California was a seasoned marksman from the frontier. Many were clerks, shopkeepers, and farmers from the East who had never held a rifle before in their lives. For these men, a missed shot meant more than just a lost opportunity. It meant another night of hardtack and hunger. The sound of their gunfire would often do nothing more than scatter wildlife for miles, alerting every creature in the valley to their presence and ensuring an empty-handed return. Furthermore, the sheer density of the mining population put an immense strain on the local animal populations. Within just a few years, the once plentiful game near the major camps was hunted to scarcity. You had to venture farther and farther into the rugged, uncharted backcountry to find anything. A journey that itself consumed precious time and energy that could have been spent working a claim. So while a successful hunter returning to camp with a deer slung over his shoulder was a hero, celebrated by all, he was also the exception. For the vast majority of miners, fresh meat remained a tantalizing, elusive dream, a brief, glorious respite from their grim rations, but never a dependable solution to the constant, grinding problem of hunger. Yet for all the talk of salt pork, beans, and the occasional wild game, there existed a category of food so rare, so extravagantly priced, that for most miners, it might as well have been made of solid gold. We're talking, of course, about fresh fruits and vegetables. In our modern world of year-round grocery stores, it's almost impossible to comprehend a life so completely severed from fresh produce. But for the 49er, a simple potato or a single apple was not just a meal. It was a status symbol, a medical necessity, and an object of pure fantasy. The reason for this scarcity was a problem of fundamental logistics. California's agricultural industry was still in its infancy, utterly incapable of meeting the sudden, massive demand created by the tidal wave of humanity flooding into the mining regions. The supply chains that did exist were long, fragile, and incredibly expensive. Imagine a wagon train of produce. It had to travel from fertile valleys, over brutal, rocky trails, and through dusty, sun-baked foothills to reach the remote camps. The journey was slow, and every hour in the sun was an hour that delicate fruits and vegetables were wilting, bruising, and rotting. By the time a wagon finally rumbled into a place like Hangtown or Rough and Ready, perhaps only half of its original cargo was even salvageable. The merchants who owned these precious shipments weren't just selling food. They were selling a miracle of preservation, and they priced it accordingly. The numbers from the era are staggering, almost comical in their absurdity until you remember the human suffering they represent. A single potato, that most humble of vegetables, could easily cost a miner $1. An onion might cost $1.50. An apple, a rare and wonderful treat, could command $2. To put that in context, a miner might work his claim for an entire day and be lucky to earn a few dollars in gold dust. Spending a full day's earnings or more on one piece of fruit was a financial decision of monumental stupidity, or one of sheer, life-saving desperation. When these precious commodities did arrive, they were often far from perfect. The potatoes might be sprouting long, pale tendrils, having been in storage for months. The apples would be soft and wrinkled, their skins leathery, but none of that mattered. To a man whose body was crying out for nutrients he couldn't name, that wrinkled apple was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He wasn't buying it for the taste alone. He was buying it as an antidote to the slow decay he felt in his own body, because this profound lack of fresh produce had a direct, gruesome, and well-known consequence: scurvy. The miners called it camp fever, or simply the scourge, and it was as much a part of the landscape as the gravelly riverbeds. It would start subtly, with a deep, unshakable fatigue that a good night's sleep couldn't fix. Then came the telltale signs: gums turning soft and spongy, swelling up like raw meat and bleeding at the slightest pressure. Teeth, once solid in the jaw, would become loose and wobbly, sometimes falling out entirely while a man was trying to chew his tough hardtack. Old wounds and scars would mysteriously reopen, and the body's simple ability to heal from a cut or a bruise would vanish. A miner could be physically powerful, capable of moving boulders all day, yet be laid low by this invisible thief of vitality, all for the lack of vitamin C found in a 50-cent lemon that now cost a fortune. This created a cruel economic paradox. A miner knew, on some level, that eating an onion or a potato could restore his health and his ability to work. But buying that potato would consume the very earnings he needed to buy his beans and flour for the next week. So, many made the calculated, heartbreaking decision to suffer the disease, to push through the lethargy and the bleeding gums, hoping to strike it rich before their bodies completely gave out. It was a high-stakes gamble where the price of a single piece of fruit wasn't just measured in dollars, but in the very days of a man's life. Amidst the sprawling chaos of tents and mud-caked shanties, one structure almost always stood apart, a beacon of civilization in the wilderness of want: the mining camp general store. This wasn't just a place to buy things, it was the absolute lifeline of the community, the epicenter of commerce, gossip, and survival itself. To step through its doorway was to leave the raw uncertainty of the gold fields and enter a world where everything had a price that was often as shocking as the items on offer. The interior was a study in organized chaos. Rough-hewn plank shelves strained under the weight of a bizarre and eclectic inventory. Next to mining pans and shovels costing a small fortune, you'd find bolts of calico fabric, barrels of nails, and stacks of wool blankets. But it was the food section that held the most magnetic, and often the most heartbreaking allure. Here sat the technological marvels of the age: canned goods. This was a relatively new invention, a miracle of preservation that promised food sealed away from pests and rot. There were cans of oysters, peaches, and condensed milk, each one a tantalizing portal to a world of flavor beyond hardtack and salt pork. Yet these shiny metal tins were also symbols of the store's cruel economics. A single can of peaches could cost $3 or $4, an amount that represented a full day's back-breaking labor, or even more, for the average miner. Alongside these modern luxuries were the staples of survival, all marked up to staggering levels. A small sack of sugar, essential for making coffee palatable, could cost $5. A pinch of cinnamon or pepper, a mere sprinkle of normalcy, was sold for a handful of silver coins. And everywhere there was tobacco chewing tobacco, smoking tobacco, cigars, perhaps the one luxury almost every miner was willing to pay any price for, a small comfort to numb the relentless grind of his existence. The man presiding over this kingdom of necessity was the storekeeper, a figure as pivotal to the gold rush story as any prospector. He was often one of the few truly wealthy men in the camp, but his fortune wasn't dug from the earth. It was calculated on a ledger, built one outrageous markup at a time. He was banker, postmaster, and information broker all in one. Miners would line up not just to buy flour, but to have their gold dust weighed and valued, to send a letter home, or to hear the latest news from San Francisco, which the storekeeper received via expensive and irregular deliveries. His relationship with the miners was a complex dance of dependency and resentment. Everyone knew his prices were exorbitant, that he was growing rich from their collective hunger. But they also knew that without him, and the supply lines he managed, the camp would simply starve. He held a monopoly on survival, and he wielded that power with a cool, businesslike demeanor. A miner might spend a week's worth of gold dust in a single visit, walking away with a sack of beans, some coffee, a can of oysters for a rare treat, and a new pick handle. The storekeeper would meticulously record the transaction, his hands clean while his customers were permanently stained with dirt. This fundamental dynamic created a stark division in the gold rush economy. While the vast majority of miners gambled their health and futures on the elusive chance of a big strike, the storekeeper operated with a business model of near certain profit. He sold the picks and pans for the dream, and he sold the beans and bacon to fuel the dreamer, extracting wealth from both hope and desperation with ruthless, undeniable efficiency. For the miner, the general store was a place of both salvation and humiliation, a reminder that in this grand adventure, the most reliable treasure wasn't in the hills, but on those crowded, chaotic shelves. Despite the individualism that drove so many to the gold fields, the harsh reality of survival soon taught a powerful lesson. There was strength in numbers, and a hot meal tasted better when shared. Out of this simple truth emerged one of the most vital social structures in the mining camps, the mess group. Miners, especially those who had traveled west together or formed partnerships to work a claim, quickly realized that pooling their resources was the only sensible way to navigate the brutal economics of food. 4 or 5 men contributing to a common pot could afford a sack of beans and a side of bacon that would have been financially crippling for a lone prospector. This collaborative spirit gave rise to a crucial, often underappreciated, figure in camp life, the camp cook. In smaller groups, this role was usually shared, with each man taking his turn at the fire according to a strict roster. A miner's day, which had begun before sunrise with a hasty cup of coffee, would pause at noon when the designated cook, who may have stayed behind from the diggings that day, would have a pot of beans and softened hardtack ready for the returning crew. In the evening, the same man would be responsible for preparing the main meal, a task that required as much patience as skill. In larger, more established companies, the group might actually pool their funds to hire a dedicated cook, paying him a wage or a share of the claim's proceeds to free the others for full-time mining. This was a strategic investment. A good cook who could turn basic rations into something vaguely appealing was worth his weight in gold dust, not just for the food itself, but for the morale he sustained. His domain was defined by one piece of equipment more than any other, the Dutch oven. This heavy, lidded pot, often made of cast iron, was the unsung hero of the Gold Rush kitchen. It was a marvel of versatility. A cook would bury it in a pit of hot coals, placing more embers on its concave lid, effectively creating a primitive, portable oven. In this single vessel, he could bake bread, simmer a stew, fry salt pork, or even attempt a rudimentary fruit cobbler if the group had splurged on a can of priceless peaches. The meal itself was almost always a one-pot affair, a thick, steaming concoction ladled out into each man's personal tin plate or bowl. And it was at this moment, when the group gathered around the fire with their food, that the true magic happened. The competitive edge of the day, the suspicion and the solitary focus on finding color in the river gravel, would momentarily fade. For a precious half hour, the camp was not a collection of rivals, but a community. Men would talk, not just of gold and claims, but of home. They'd share stories, news, and sometimes, if a letter had arrived, read aloud from loved ones thousands of miles away. They might pass around a shared bottle of whiskey, play a tune on a harmonica, or simply eat in a comfortable silence that spoke of shared exhaustion and mutual reliance. This nightly ritual was a powerful anchor in a world of chaos, a small pocket of civilization carved out of the wilderness. It reaffirmed the bonds of partnership and provided a psychological sustenance that was, in its own way, as vital as the beans and bacon in their bowls. In the flickering firelight, with a full stomach and the company of others, a miner could briefly remember what it was like to be part of something larger than his own solitary dream. But while the day-to-day reality for most miners was a grim cycle of hardtack and bean pots, the sudden, explosive wealth that a lucky few discovered created a culinary phenomenon that was its complete opposite. a dish born not from scarcity, but from pure, unadulterated extravagance. This is the story of the Hangtown Fry, a legendary omelet that perfectly encapsulates the dizzying highs and absurd economics of the era. The tale, as it's been passed down, goes something like this. A prospector, fresh from a rich strike on the American River, stumbles into the bustling settlement of Hangtown, a place later renamed the more respectable Placerville. His pockets are bulging with gold nuggets, and he is bursting with a primal need to celebrate his sudden change in fortune. He marches straight into the most prominent saloon or boarding house he can find, slams his fist on the counter, and announces to the cook that he wants the most expensive meal the establishment can possibly prepare. Money for this man is suddenly no object. The cook, faced with this extraordinary demand, is forced to think, what, in this remote outpost, constitutes the ultimate luxury? His mind immediately goes to the ingredients with the most outrageous price tags. First, eggs. In a land with almost no chicken coops, a single egg could cost $1 or more, a breathtaking sum. Second, bacon. While salt pork was common good quality, smoked bacon was a far rarer and more costly commodity. And finally, the ultimate indulgence, oysters. This was the stroke of genius that cemented the dish in history. Despite being hundreds of miles from the ocean, live oysters were actually available in the Sierra foothills, shipped on ice from San Francisco Bay in a remarkable feat of logistics. The journey was long and difficult. Keeping them in a state of perfect preservation was a constant battle, and by the time they arrived, their price was astronomical. A single oyster could cost as much as a miner's daily earnings, so the cook cracked a half dozen of those precious eggs into a bowl, fried up slices of that expensive bacon, and then added the crowning glory, a handful of fresh, briny oysters, pan-fried until their edges were crisp. He folded it all into a magnificent, golden omelet and served it to the wealthy miner. In that one plate was the entire gold rush story, the backbreaking labor, the elusive dream, the sudden, life-altering payoff, and the desperate, immediate desire to transform raw gold into tangible pleasure. The Hangtown Fry was more than just a meal. It was a performance, a declaration of victory, and a powerful middle finger to the months of deprivation that had come before. It was edible triumph. The dish's enduring legacy is a testament to its powerful symbolism. It wasn't invented in a royal kitchen or a famous restaurant. It was born in the rough and tumble heart of the mining frontier, a direct product of the era's unique, topsy-turvy economy where value was whatever a man with a heavy pouch was willing to pay. The fact that the Hangtown Fry remains on menus in Northern California to this day, a beloved classic, is a direct link back to that moment of delirious success. It allows us to taste, quite literally, the explosive moment when a dream came true, when a man who had survived on weevil-infested crackers could, for one glorious meal, feast like a king. It represents the ultimate what-if scenario that drew every single person west the fantasy of walking into a saloon and, with a single order, consuming the very proof of your own luck. If salt pork and beans fueled the body, there was another substance that fueled the very spirit of the gold rush, a dark, bitter, and utterly essential brew that was as much a part of a miner's kit as his pickaxe: coffee. In an existence defined by hardship, coffee was the one universal luxury, a non-negotiable staple consumed in quantities that would stagger the modern coffee shop patron. Its preparation was as straightforward and rugged as the men who drank it. There were no delicate pour-overs or fine grinds here. Beans were roughly crushed in a small, hand-cranked grinder, a device whose distinctive, rattling sound was the clarion call of dawn in every camp, from the most isolated creek bed to the largest tent city. These coarse grounds were then tossed directly into a pot of water, often the same battered tin pot used for cooking beans, and set to boil over the fire. It was left to bubble and steep for a long time, resulting in a brew that was thick, potent, and intensely bitter. A liquid so strong it was often described as being able to float a horseshoe. This wasn't a beverage for savoring subtle notes of citrus or chocolate. This was coffee as a tool, a jolt of pure, unadulterated caffeine designed for a single purpose: survival. The physical demands of the mining life cannot be overstated. A miner's day began before sunrise and ended after sunset, a relentless cycle of swinging a heavy pick, shoveling tons of gravel, and standing for hours in ice-cold river water. Fatigue was a constant gnawing enemy, and coffee was the primary weapon against it. That first cup in the chilly morning air was more than just a warm drink. It was a chemical jump start, sharpening the mind and steeling the body for the brutal hours ahead. It provided a momentary illusion of warmth in a damp climate, and a crucial mental focus needed for the tedious, eye-straining work of scanning riverbed sediment for the faintest glitter of gold. Beyond its role as a mere stimulant, coffee served another, equally vital function. It made the water safe to drink. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the mining camps, water sources were frequently contaminated with runoff from latrines and animal waste, carrying pathogens that could cause typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. By bringing the water to a rolling boil for the coffee, miners were unknowingly purifying it, killing the dangerous microbes that could lay a strong man low in a matter of days. The powerful, assertive flavor of the coffee itself then effectively masked the often unpleasant, minerally or muddy taste of the local water supply. This transformed a potentially deadly act of hydration into a daily ritual of pleasure and safety. Finally, coffee was a powerful social bond, the centerpiece of what little camaraderie existed in a fiercely competitive environment. The act of sharing a pot of coffee created a tiny, temporary community. It was the excuse for a brief pause, a moment where men would huddle around the fire, cups in hand, to discuss their prospects, share rumors of a new strike, or simply sit in a shared, comfortable silence. In a world where so much was uncertain, the bitter, familiar taste of coffee was a rare constant, a small piece of domestic normalcy in a landscape of chaos. It was a comfort, a medicine, and a tool all in one, and without its dark, energizing power, the monumental effort of the gold rush might well have ground to a halt far sooner. And yet, for all their reliance on imported goods and hunted game, a few miners gradually began to see the California landscape not just as a source of mineral wealth, but as a potential larder in its own right. This was a slow, difficult learning process. These men, arriving from the farms and cities of the East and Midwest, were strangers in a strange land. The plants, the trees, the very soil were unfamiliar. What looked like a tempting berry could be violently poisonous. A root that appeared edible might cause severe illness. Navigating this botanical minefield required a guide, and the most knowledgeable guides of all were the people who had called this land home for thousands of years, the local Native American tribes. This created a complex and often tragic paradox. The gold rush itself was a cataclysmic event of displacement and violence against these very tribes, as miners overran their ancestral lands, polluted their rivers, and decimated the game they depended on. Yet, in the midst of this profound injustice, isolated and pragmatic instances of knowledge transfer occurred. A miner, lost and hungry, might be given food by a small band. A trading encounter at the edge of a camp could involve more than just goods. It could include a quiet lesson in what was safe to eat. Through observation and these fleeting interactions, some 49ers began to learn the secrets of the Sierra foothills. They discovered that the hard, starchy bulbs of the broadilla plant, which the Miwok people called Indian potatoes, could be roasted or boiled into a nutritious, potato-like food. They learned to identify the sweet, dark purple fruits of the manzanita bush, which could be eaten fresh or dried into a leathery fruit, leather for sustenance on long trips. They found that the kernels of the California black oak's acorns, while unbearably bitter and tannic when raw, could be processed by leaching them in water for days to create a versatile flour, a staple of the indigenous diet for millennia. This was not a matter of simple foraging. It was the adoption of a sophisticated, time-tested technology for survival. The indigenous knowledge of the land was encyclopedic. Tribes knew which creek banks to scour for watercress, a peppery green rich in vitamins that could fight off scurvy. They knew where to find wild onions and miner's lettuce, a succulent whose name in the modern era actually comes from its use by 49ers as a fresh salad green. They understood the seasonal cycles of berries and nuts, creating a calendar of abundance that the newly arrived miners, in their frantic, year-round search for gold, were completely blind to. For the miners who were smart enough or desperate enough to pay attention, this knowledge was a lifeline. It provided crucial variety and vital nutrients that were completely absent from their standard rations. A handful of pine nuts foraged from a digger pine offered healthy fats and protein. A salad of miner's lettuce gave a much-needed burst of vitamin C. This was, however, a one-sided exchange. While miners benefited immensely from this indigenous wisdom, the cultural and physical destruction wrought by the gold seekers was absolute. The streams where tribes fished were muddied by mining runoff. The grasslands where they gathered seeds were trampled by livestock. And the very society that held this deep ecological knowledge was being systematically dismantled. The miners took the practical survival tips while largely ignoring the spiritual and cultural context that gave them meaning. They saw the Indian potato as a convenient root, not as a sacred gift from the earth embedded in a rich cultural tradition. This dynamic makes the story of foraging during the gold rush a deeply poignant and ambiguous one. It stands as a rare glimmer of practical cooperation in a dark chapter of American history, demonstrating that human ingenuity for survival can sometimes create bridges even in the midst of catastrophic conflict. Yet it also highlights the profound loss, as a vast repository of environmental knowledge was eroded alongside the people who had nurtured it for generations, all for the fleeting glitter of gold. This constant, desperate search for sustenance, whether from a store shelf, a hunting rifle, or the wild landscape itself, was only one front in the miners' war for survival. There existed an even more insidious and ever-present threat, one that flowed freely through every camp, lining every creek bed, and filling every drinking cup: the water itself. In their quest for gold, the 49ers had unwittingly poisoned their own lifeline. The very rivers and streams that provided the water for drinking, cooking, and the all-important sluicing of gold-bearing gravel were transformed into open sewers and chemical dumping grounds. The logic of the camps was simple and devastating. With no sanitation systems to speak of, human waste was simply disposed of in the most convenient location, often a shallow trench dug far too close to the water source. A heavy rain would wash this filth directly into the creek, contaminating it for every camp downstream. But the pollution wasn't just biological. The mining process itself introduced a terrifying new cocktail of toxins. To separate fine gold from the surrounding dirt and gravel, miners used liquid mercury, which has a unique chemical property of binding with gold to form an amalgam. This mercury, along with arsenic and other heavy metals naturally present in the ore, was then washed freely back into the river systems, creating a silent, invisible poison that permeated the entire aquatic environment. A miner kneeling in a stream to pan for gold was literally standing in a dilute, toxic waste dump, and the water he cupped in his hands to drink was a hazardous brew. The consequences of consuming this contaminated water were swift, brutal, and humiliating. The most common affliction was dysentery, a severe intestinal infection that causes inflammation of the colon. Its symptoms were horrific and debilitating. A sufferer would be gripped by agonizing cramps and a relentless, uncontrollable diarrhea that was often bloody. The disease rapidly dehydrated and weakened its victims, sapping their strength and confining them to a crude latrine, or more often, just the nearest bushes in a state of utter misery. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of a mining camp, dysentery could spread like wildfire, incapacitating entire groups of men at once. But dysentery was just one villain in a gallery of waterborne horrors. Typhoid fever, caused by bacteria in contaminated food or water, would bring on a high fever, profound weakness, a rash, and intestinal perforation, often proving fatal. Cholera, though less common in California than in other gold rush destinations like Australia, was the most feared of all. capable of killing a healthy person through violent dehydration in a matter of hours. These illnesses created a cruel paradox. The hard physical labor of mining created an intense, unceasing thirst, yet satisfying that thirst with the most readily available substance. The cold, clear-looking water of the mountain stream was a potentially fatal gamble. A man could be strong enough to move a boulder one day and be dead from a sip of water the next. This pervasive, justifiable fear of the water supply fundamentally reshaped the drinking habits of the era and explains the incredible cultural importance of two other liquids, coffee and whiskey. Boiling water for coffee, as we've discussed, was an accidental but vital form of purification, killing the bacteria that caused dysentery and typhoid. But whiskey served a similar, though more psychologically than scientifically grounded, purpose. Many miners held a deep-seated belief that the high alcohol content in whiskey could somehow kill the badness in water. While it wouldn't have been effective against the concentrated pathogens found in a contaminated creek, the common practice was to mix a splash of whiskey into a cup of questionable water, both to mask the foul taste and to provide a sense of security. In a world where clear water could be a death sentence, the bitter sting of coffee and the burning comfort of whiskey weren't just luxuries. They were perceived, rightly in one case and wrongly in the other, as essential tools for navigating a landscape where the most basic element of life had become a primary agent of death. Amidst the overwhelming reality of hardtack and salted meat, a technological marvel began to appear on those crowded general store shelves, offering a glimpse into a future where food could defy time and distance. This was the era of the can, a revolutionary invention that, for a price, could deliver a perfect peach from a distant orchard or a briny oyster from the depths of the bay directly to a miner's camp in the Sierra Nevada. The process itself was a wonder of the age. Food was sealed inside sturdy tin-plated steel containers, which were then heated to a high temperature to destroy any spoilage agents before being hermetically sealed. This created a tiny, self-contained environment where food could remain preserved for years, utterly immune to the weevils, mold, and rancidity that plagued every other staple in the miner's larder. For men whose diets were defined by monotony and decay, the pristine, unspoiled contents of a can were nothing short of magical. To pry open a can of peaches was to release a burst of summer fragrance, a sweetness so intense and pure it felt like a memory from another life. To spoon up a canned oyster was to taste the clean, cold salt of the ocean, a flavor that transported them instantly from their dusty, landlocked existence to the bustling wharves of San Francisco. These weren't just meals, they were sensory time capsules, offering a powerful and emotional connection to the world they had left behind. Of course, this miracle of preservation came with a cost that reflected its immense value. A single can of condensed milk, that thick, sweet, shelf-stable dairy product, could easily cost $2 or $3. A can of oysters might cost $5. For a miner earning a few dollars a day, purchasing such an item was a significant financial decision, akin to spending $100 or more on a single ingredient for one meal today. This transformed canned goods from mere sustenance into powerful social and emotional currency. A can of peaches wasn't just a can of peaches, it was a statement. A miner might buy one to celebrate a modest strike, sharing the syrupy slices with his messmates in a ritual of shared success that bolstered the morale of the entire group. It could be a romantic gesture, a priceless gift for a rare woman in the camps, or a desperate peace offering to a business partner after a bitter dispute. The very act of opening a can was an event. It required a strong knife and determination, or later, a special purpose-built can opener, and the distinctive sound of the metal lid giving way would draw the attention of everyone nearby. The sharing of these luxurious contents was a deliberate act of community and generosity, a brief but powerful reminder of civility and shared pleasure in a world otherwise ruled by individual struggle and competition. The impact of this technology extended beyond simple indulgence. It had profound practical and psychological effects. Canned condensed milk, for instance, revolutionized the simple act of drinking coffee. For the first time, Miners could enjoy it with a creamy sweetness that masked the bitterness of their rough brew and the off tastes of the local water, transforming a functional caffeine delivery system into a genuine comfort. More importantly, canned fruits and vegetables offered a reliable, though expensive, defense against the scourge of scurvy, while fresh produce was fleeting and often rotten upon arrival. A can of tomatoes or peaches held its nutritional value perfectly. A miner feeling the early lethargy and gum tenderness of vitamin deficiency could, if he could afford it, buy a can and ingest a concentrated dose of the very nutrient his body was screaming for. This gave him a degree of control over his health that was previously unimaginable. The psychological lift was just as critical. In an environment of relentless hardship, where every day was a battle against the elements and disappointment, the ability to access a perfect, unchanging, and delicious food item provided a powerful antidote to despair. It was a tangible piece of certainty in an uncertain world, a guaranteed pleasure that could not be spoiled by weather, pests, or time. The can was a promise that normality and delight could still exist, even here, if one had the gold to pay for it. This new ability to purchase a perfect, preserved piece of the outside world fundamentally altered the miner's relationship with his environment, proving that even in the most remote and brutal of circumstances, human ingenuity was beginning to bridge the gap between mere survival and something resembling a life worth living. But as the camps settled and evolved from chaotic tent cities into more permanent towns, a new, more refined aroma began to compete with the ever-present scent of wood smoke and mud, the unmistakable, tangy smell of freshly baked bread. This signaled the rise of a new kind of entrepreneur, the baker, and with him came a culinary revolution powered by a living, breathing ingredient that would become synonymous with the frontier itself, sourdough. While hardtack had been the durable, tasteless fuel of necessity, sourdough bread represented a step toward civilization, a return to a more familiar and comforting form of sustenance. The key to this transformation was the starter, a simple mixture of flour and water that, left to its own devices, would capture wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria from the very air of California. This created a stable, self-perpetuating leavening agent that was far more reliable and flavorful than the unpredictable, commercially produced yeast cakes that might spoil on the long journey west. For a miner, his sourdough starter wasn't just a cooking ingredient, it was a living companion, a prized possession often guarded as closely as his poke of gold dust. He would keep it in a special crock, usually nestled close to his body at night, for warmth or buried near his fire to protect the delicate culture from freezing temperatures. A healthy, bubbling starter was a sign of a well-managed camp and a capable cook, and a man who could maintain one earned a certain respect among his peers. In fact, the term sourdough itself became a badge of honor, a nickname for the most experienced and seasoned prospectors, the ones who had been through a winter in the mountains and kept their starter and their hopes alive. The versatility of this magical pot of fermented dough was its true genius. Of course, it was used to bake loaves of bread. A miner would shape his dough and then bake it in that most versatile of tools, the Dutch oven, burying the heavy-lidded pot in a pit of hot coals to create a makeshift, yet remarkably effective, oven. The resulting loaf had a thick, crackly crust and a chewy, open crumb, with a distinctive, tangy flavor that cut through the monotony of a salt pork diet. But the uses didn't stop there. That same starter could be thinned out with a little more water and flour to create a batter for pancakes, a breakfast that felt like a luxury after months of cold hardtack. These sourdough flapjacks, fried up in a greased skillet, were lighter and more complex than any made with baking soda, with a subtle acidity that made them incredibly tender. On a really good morning, a miner might even drizzle them with precious molasses or sugar. And in a pinch, a ball of sourdough could be stretched out and fried directly in rendered fat, creating a simple, satisfying fry bread that was both quick to make and immensely filling. This living culture was a tiny, resilient ecosystem in a pot, a self-replenishing resource in a world defined by scarcity. It provided a sense of continuity and domestic comfort, a daily ritual of feeding and maintaining that connected these rugged men to a more settled way of life. The smell of a sourdough loaf baking in a Dutch oven was more than just a pleasant aroma. It was the smell of perseverance, of ingenuity, and of a small but significant victory in the endless battle to not just survive, but to live. And so, while sourdough represented the pinnacle of frontier baking, requiring days of foresight and careful maintenance, the daily reality for most miners was a far more immediate and improvisational affair. When the craving for something warm, fast, and freshly cooked struck, they turned to a family of simple, almost primitive breads that could be mixed and cooked in minutes over an open flame. The undisputed king of these quick breads was the slapjack. The name itself evokes its simple preparation: a slap of dough into a hot pan. The recipe was the very definition of minimalism. A miner would take a handful of his precious flour, always a costly commodity, and mix it with a little water and a pinch of salt right in his tin plate or a bowl, stirring it into a thick, sticky batter. There was no yeast, no baking soda, no egg. This was sustenance stripped to its bare essentials. He would then grease his one indispensable cooking skillet with a smear of bacon fat or pork lard, get it good and hot over the coals of his fire, and pour or spoon the batter directly onto the sizzling surface. Within moments, the air would fill with a deeply comforting, toasty aroma, a world away from the stale scent of hardtack. The slapjack would bubble and set, and after a few minutes, he'd flip it with his knife, revealing a beautiful, golden brown crust. What emerged from the pan was a dense, chewy pancake, more akin to a flatbread than the fluffy breakfast item we know today. Its flavor was plain and weedy, a blank canvas that served as a vehicle for whatever scant flavoring he had on hand. A miner might eat it straight from the pan, tearing off hot pieces to dip into a pot of beans or to soak up the last bits of salt pork grease. If he was feeling particularly prosperous, he might drizzle it with a little molasses or sprinkle it with sugar, transforming it into a rare and delightful treat. The slapjack's greatest virtue was its speed and simplicity. It required no special equipment beyond a single pan, no advanced planning, and very little skill. It was the ultimate answer to the question of what to eat when you were too exhausted from a day of digging to cook anything complicated, but too weary of hardtack to face another dry, tooth-cracking biscuit. It provided the psychological comfort of hot, fresh bread with a minimum of effort, a small but significant victory over the grim realities of campfire cookery. But the slapjack was just one star in a whole constellation of simple breads born from necessity and cooked with whatever was at hand. When a miner didn't even have a pan, or when he was on the move and traveling light, his ingenuity took over, leading to even more elemental methods. One of the most ancient was the ash cake. For this, a miner would take his basic flour and water dough and shape it into a thick, round cake. Instead of using a pan, he would then carefully place this dough ball directly into the hot ashes and embers at the edge of his campfire. He would let it bake there, buried in the coals, for several minutes before using a stick to flip it over and bake the other side. When he judged it done, he would pull it from the fire and knock it sharply against a rock or his knee to dislodge the crust of ash and charcoal. The result was a loaf with a tough, blackened exterior that protected a surprisingly soft and steaming interior. Eating an ash cake was an exercise in care, as you had to break it open carefully to avoid getting a mouthful of grit, but the reward was a smoky, primal bread that felt connected to the most fundamental traditions of outdoor survival. Another common variation was the hoe cake, a name that harkens back to its agricultural origins on southern plantations. When a cooking skillet wasn't available, a miner would use the next best flat, heat-conducting surface he had, the metal blade of his hoe or a shovel. He would clean the blade as best he could, prop it up near the fire to get it hot, and then spread his simple batter directly onto the metal. The name is a bit misleading, as he certainly wasn't using his valuable mining tools to plant crops, but the method was the same. The batter would sizzle and cook on the improvised griddle, creating a flatbread that was crisp on the bottom and soft on top. This practice speaks volumes about the resourcefulness of these men. Every object had multiple uses. A shovel was for digging for gold, for digging a latrine, and when necessary, for baking your dinner. These simple breads, the slapjack, the ash cake, The hoe cake were more than just food. They were a direct expression of the miners' transient, rugged existence. They required no settling down, no permanent infrastructure. They could be made anywhere a fire could be lit, with the most basic of ingredients and tools. In a life defined by uncertainty and impermanence, the act of mixing flour and water and transforming it, through fire, into something warm and nourishing was a small ritual of creation and self-reliance. It was a way to assert a tiny bit of control over a chaotic environment, to provide a moment of warmth and comfort that was made entirely by their own hands, a humble but powerful testament to the human need for more than just mere fuel, but for the simple, soul-satisfying pleasure of fresh bread. Yet for all its physical importance, food held a power over the miners that went far beyond mere sustenance, reaching deep into the human heart and spirit. In a world of isolation and backbreaking labor, a familiar taste could be a potent anchor to a life left behind, while the relentless monotony of the daily fare could erode morale as effectively as any physical hardship. Consider the profound loneliness of a man who had not seen his family in over a year, living in a noisy camp of strangers, his only constant companions being hunger and exhaustion. In that context, food was never just calories. It was memory. A man from New England might spend a week's earnings on a small sack of flour, not just to make slapjacks, but to painstakingly recreate his wife's biscuit recipe, the scent of them baking in his Dutch oven transporting him thousands of miles to a warm kitchen and a family breakfast table. A German immigrant might trade for a single, precious sausage, its spices and smoky flavor a direct line to the butcher shops of his hometown. These were not just meals, they were edible letters, a way to converse with a past that felt increasingly distant and dreamlike. The act of preparing a familiar dish was a ritual of remembrance, a way to assert one's identity and cling to a sense of self in a place that seemed determined to strip it all away. A well-cooked, shared meal around the campfire could temporarily silence the anxieties of failure. For a brief hour, with a full stomach and the taste of something resembling home on their tongues, men weren't failed prospectors. They were fathers, brothers, and sons again, sharing stories and laughter, their morale lifted by a simple, communal act of nourishment. The camp cook who could consistently provide a hot, palatable meal was often the most valuable man in a company, not for his culinary skill, but for his role as a guardian of mental well-being. Conversely, the psychological toll of the standard diet was devastating and relentless. The same meal, day after day, week after week, created a crushing sense of despair. The sight of the same bean pot, the smell of the same salt pork, the crunch of the same weevil-infested hardtack, these were not just sensory experiences. They were constant, grinding reminders of their harsh reality and their separation from civilization. This culinary tedium fed directly into a deep and pervasive homesickness. The inability to access the flavors of home made the miners feel perpetually displaced, forever strangers in a hostile land. The poor quality of the food itself, the rancid meat, the moldy flour, the gritty coffee, was a daily insult, a physical manifestation of their degraded circumstances. It reinforced the feeling that they had fallen from a state of grace, that they were living like animals in their pursuit of wealth. This dietary despair contributed to a condition the miners themselves called the blues, a profound melancholy that could paralyze a man as effectively as any disease. He would lose the motivation to work his claim, sitting forlornly by his tent, staring into the distance, his spirit broken not by a lack of gold, but by a lack of hope, a hope that was intimately tied to the simple human comfort of a good meal. In this way, the miner's stomach became the battlefield for his soul. A single taste of something familiar could fortify his resolve for weeks, while the unending cycle of bleak and unappetizing food could push him to the brink of giving up entirely, proving that in the struggle for survival, the fight against despair was often just as critical as the fight against starvation. This dramatic divide in fortune was mirrored perfectly, and perhaps most painfully, in the food that ended up on a miner's plate. The gold rush created a society of almost instantaneous haves and have-nots, and the chasm between them was measured not just in ounces of gold dust, but in the fundamental quality of their daily bread. For the successful miner, the one who had found a rich vein or a lucrative pocket of nuggets, the world of California was suddenly transformed from a landscape of scarcity into a personal pantry of plenty. With a heavy purse, he could command the very best that the frantic new economy had to offer. He could walk into a burgeoning city like San Francisco or Sacramento and dine in a restaurant that would not have been out of place in New York or Paris. These establishments, catering to the newly wealthy, served multi-course meals on fine china. The menus featured oysters freshly shipped on ice, thick cuts of prime beef from ranches in the Sacramento Valley, and even exotic imports like French pâté and fine cheeses. He could order bottles of claret or champagne, wines that cost more than a struggling prospector might earn in a month, washing down a meal that was as much about performance and status as it was about nutrition. This was a life of consumption, a public display of success where the ability to eat well was the most immediate and satisfying proof that the dream had been realized. He could afford to hire a personal cook for his camp, a professional who could prepare fresh game, bake pastries, and ensure a steady supply of clean, varied food that kept his crew healthy, energetic, and loyal. For this man, the memory of weevil-infested hardtack and rancid pork was not a present reality, but a story to be told over a glass of brandy, a dark tale from a past he had successfully escaped. In stark, heartbreaking contrast stood the diet of the average prospector, the man for whom a big strike remained a maddening illusion. For every one miner who feasted on steak and champagne, there were hundreds who faced a daily, grinding battle against hunger itself. When a man's claim yielded little more than a few cents worth of gold dust per day, his choices became brutally limited. The expensive goods in the general store, the fresh eggs, the canned peaches, the good bacon, were not just luxuries. They were completely out of reach, taunting him from the shelves like artifacts from another world. His diet devolved into a desperate, monotonous struggle for calories. The standard bean pot and salt pork became a best-case scenario. When times got truly hard, even these basics could become unaffordable. His meals would shrink in quantity and quality, thinning out into a watery gruel made from a handful of cornmeal or flour stirred into a pot of boiling water, a meager concoction that did little to quiet the gnawing in his belly. He might be reduced to a near-starvation diet of whatever small game he could snare, a stringy jackrabbit or a handful of squirrels stretched across several days, supplemented with whatever edible weeds or roots he could safely identify. In the most dire circumstances, pride would give way to necessity, and a desperate man might be forced to beg for scraps from a more successful camp or offer to perform grueling manual labor for other miners in exchange for nothing more than a single, solid meal. The physical toll of this deprivation was severe and visible. While the wealthy miner grew robust on a diet of fresh meat and vegetables, the struggling prospector became gaunt, his ribs showing through a sunburned chest, his energy reserves perpetually depleted. The symptoms of scurvy and other deficiency diseases were not abstract threats, but a constant reality, slowly sapping his strength and clouding his mind. His world shrank from the grand dream of a fortune to the immediate, humbling goal of finding enough food to make it through the week. The inequality of the era was thus etched onto their very bodies. You could walk through a mining camp and, with a single glance, separate the successful from the failing. It was in the clearness of their eyes, the firmness of their step, and the simple, profound fact of whether their next meal would be a celebration or yet another exercise in grim endurance. This culinary divide was the ultimate symbol of the gold rush's central irony. It created a small class of kings who dined like royalty, while the vast army of laborers who powered the entire enterprise often went to sleep with their hunger only partially satisfied, their dreams of wealth slowly replaced by the more basic dream of a full stomach. In a world where clear water could kill and the daily diet was a soul-crushing exercise in monotony, it's no surprise that miners turned to another liquid for solace, a substance that flowed as freely as ambition in the camps: alcohol. Whiskey, in particular, was the lifeblood of the mining frontier, a ubiquitous presence in every tent saloon and makeshift lodging house. It was a currency, a comfort, and a crutch, serving a multitude of purposes far beyond simple inebriation. On a purely practical level, whiskey was often perceived as a safer alternative to the dangerously contaminated local water. While this belief was more psychological than scientific, the alcohol content in most diluted bar whiskey wasn't high enough to reliably kill pathogens. It provided a powerful sense of security. A miner could justify a drink by telling himself he was purifying his innards, turning a potential vice into a perceived act of survival. Beyond this, alcohol functioned as a powerful, albeit temporary, anesthetic. After 10 or 12 hours of slamming a pick into unyielding rock or standing knee-deep in freezing river water, a man's body would be racked with pain. A few shots of whiskey couldn't heal the sore muscles or the aching joints, but it could dull the edges of that pain, allowing for a few hours of fitful sleep before the cycle began again at dawn. It was a chemical reset button for an exhausted body and a weary spirit, a way to numb the physical reality of a brutal existence. The sheer variety of alcohol available reflected the chaotic and unregulated nature of the camps themselves. At the more respectable end of the spectrum were imported brandies and properly aged whiskeys, shipped in from the East or even Europe. These fine spirits, however, were exorbitantly priced, reserved for the lucky few celebrating a major strike. For the vast majority of miners, the drink of the day was a rough, generic whiskey, often distilled in bulk in San Francisco and then shipped to the mountains in barrels. This standard bar whiskey was typically watered down by the saloon keeper to increase profits, and then doctored with various ingredients to restore its bite and color. A little burnt sugar or molasses could give it a darker, more aged appearance, while a splash of chewing tobacco juice or sometimes even cayenne pepper was added to provide the burning sensation that drinkers associated with potency. This was the everyday drink, harsh and unrefined, but it was at least produced with some semblance of a recipe. The real danger, however, lay in the homemade concoctions that proliferated in the most remote camps, where legitimate supplies were scarce and entrepreneurial, or desperate individuals took matters into their own hands. This is where we enter the world of drinks with names that sound like warnings: tarantula juice, rot gut, panther's breath, and strychnine. These were not clever marketing terms. They were grimly accurate descriptions born from experience. Rot gut implied the drink was so corrosive it could damage your intestines. Tarantula juice suggested a bite with deadly consequences. The recipes for these moonshines were as horrifying as their names. A common base might be pure grain alcohol, often intended for industrial use, which was then cut with any available liquid, including water from the polluted local creeks. To give this poisonous mixture some semblance of flavor, bootleggers would add anything they had on hand: turpentine, gunpowder, boiled tobacco, or even sulfuric acid. The goal was to create a liquid so powerfully abrasive that a single sip would shock the system, delivering an immediate and intense intoxication that masked the underlying horror of the ingredients. Drinking this stuff was a genuine gamble with one's life, leading to violent illness, blindness, or even death. Yet the demand was so high that men were willing to take the risk for a few hours of blessed oblivion. The saloon itself was the epicenter of this alcoholic culture, functioning as far more than just a place to drink. In a landscape devoid of theaters, meeting halls, or churches, the saloon was the communal living room. It was a space for socialization, where news from the outside world was shared. Rumors of new strikes were debated with feverish intensity, and business partnerships were formed over a shared bottle. The act of buying around was a powerful social lubricant, a way to build camaraderie and forge temporary alliances in a fiercely competitive environment. For a few coins, a lonely miner could purchase the illusion of companionship, standing at a rough-hewn plank bar and conversing with other men who understood his struggles. Yet this social function had a dark and manipulative underside. Saloon keepers and the professional gamblers who were their constant companions were masters of psychology. They understood that a drunk miner was a loose-fisted miner, one more likely to gamble away his tiny stash of gold dust or be swindled in a crooked business deal. The free lunch, a saloon staple, was a brilliant trap. A man could get a free, salty meal of cold cuts, bread, and pickled eggs, but the intense saltiness would inevitably drive him to buy more and more drinks to quench his thirst. This created a vicious cycle of drinking and spending that could drain a week's earnings in a single hazy evening. In this context, alcohol was not just an escape, it was a tool of exploitation, carefully wielded to separate the miner from his hard-won wealth. Ultimately, the role of alcohol in the mining camps was a profound paradox. It was both a medicine and a poison, a social glue and a destructive force. It offered a temporary escape from the relentless physical pain, the gnawing hunger, and the deep, crushing loneliness of life in the diggings. In the warm, numbing embrace of a whiskey bottle, a man could forget his failures, his homesickness, and the bleeding of his gums for a few precious hours. He could feel, however fleetingly, a sense of connection and cheer. But this escape came at a terrible cost. The very tarantula juice that promised relief could permanently damage his health. The money spent on drink was money not spent on the fresh vegetables that could have cured his scurvy or the better tools that might have improved his claim. The alcoholism that ran rampant through the camps destroyed partnerships, ruined health, and led men into destitution just as effectively as a played-out claim. It was a coping mechanism for an almost unbearable reality, but one that often deepened the misery it was meant to alleviate. The miner's relationship with alcohol perfectly mirrored his relationship with the gold fields themselves. It was a high-stakes gamble that promised a glittering reward, but all too often delivered only a hollow, and sometimes fatal, consolation. Faced with the twin terrors of rot and scarcity, a miner's survival often hinged not just on finding food, but on his ability to wage a constant war against time itself. Without any form of mechanical refrigeration, he had to become a master of ancient preservation arts, using salt, smoke, and ingenuity to create a larder that could withstand the heat, the humidity, and the relentless march of the seasons. The most common and critical method for preserving precious meat was a technique as old as civilization: heavy salting. When a hunter managed to bring down a deer or a rancher drove a steer into camp for slaughter, the clock started ticking immediately. The community would work quickly, butchering the animal and then taking the large cuts of meat and completely encasing them in a thick crust of coarse salt. This wasn't a light seasoning. It was a full-on chemical assault on the bacteria that caused spoilage. The salt would draw the moisture out of the meat through a process called osmosis, creating an environment far too dry for microorganisms to thrive. These salt-crusted haunches would then be packed tightly into barrels, often with more salt poured between the layers, creating a sterile environment where the meat could remain edible for many months. When the time came to eat it, the process was almost the reverse of preservation. The cook would have to hack off a piece of the rock-hard, salt-encrusted meat and soak it for hours, sometimes even days, in multiple changes of fresh water to rehydrate it and leach out enough salt to make it palatable. It was a time-consuming and tedious process, but it was the only way to have a reserve of protein that didn't rely on the whims of a storekeeper's supply chain. For those with a little more time and space, smoking offered a different and often more flavorful solution. A miner or a camp cook would construct a simple smokehouse, which could be anything from a carefully built small shack to a repurposed barrel set over a pit. The key was a slow, smoldering fire made from specific types of wood, often hardwoods like oak or hickory if they were available, but more commonly, whatever non-resinous wood was at hand. The goal wasn't to cook the meat with high heat, but to bathe it in a constant, cool stream of smoke for days on end. This smoke served two vital purposes. First, the smoke itself contained phenolic compounds that acted as natural preservatives, inhibiting the growth of bacteria and mold on the surface of the meat. Second, the gentle, ambient heat helped to further dehydrate the meat, driving out the moisture that spoilage organisms needed to live. The result was smoked jerky or larger smoked hams that had a rich, complex flavor and a leathery texture that could last for weeks without refrigeration. This method was particularly popular for preserving fish caught in the abundant rivers. A successful day of fishing could yield dozens of trout or salmon, far more than a camp could eat at one time. The fish would be cleaned, split open, and then hung on racks inside the smokehouse, emerging days later as deeply colored, smoky fillets that could be carried in a pocket as a high-protein snack or reconstituted in a stew. Smoking transformed a fleeting abundance into a stable, portable resource, a testament to the miner's ability to harness the elements to serve his needs. Perhaps the most straightforward method of all was simple air drying or jerking. This technique, borrowed from Native American practices, was the ultimate in minimalist preservation. Strips of lean meat, usually from game like deer or rabbit, were cut into thin, uniform slices and then heavily salted. These strips were then laid out on racks in the open air, ideally in a spot with good airflow and plenty of sunshine. The dry California air and the sun's warmth would slowly but surely evaporate all the moisture from the meat, leaving behind a tough, chewy, and incredibly durable product known as jerky. This was the ultimate travel food for a prospector on the move. It was incredibly lightweight, wouldn't spoil, and could be eaten without any preparation whatsoever. A miner could carry a pouch of jerky in his pocket for weeks, gnawing on a piece when he needed a burst of energy during a long day of digging, without ever having to stop and build a fire. It was pure, condensed protein, a direct link between the hunter's success and the miner's sustained labor. The flavor was intensely salty and meaty, a concentrated essence that was a world away from the bland monotony of beans. In a sense, jerky was the perfect gold rush food. It was practical, efficient, and born entirely from the necessity of a mobile, hard-scrabble existence. Beyond these active methods of curing, miners also employed clever, passive techniques to keep food cool for short periods, creating rudimentary versions of the modern refrigerator. One of the most common was to exploit the one reliably cold thing in their environment, the mountain streams. A miner would take his perishable goods, perhaps a piece of fresh meat traded from a rancher, a few eggs, or some butter, and place them in a sealed container, often a metal pail or a tightly wrapped cloth bundle. He would then submerge this container in the cold, fast-moving water of a creek, securing it with a rope to a tree on the bank or weighing it down with a heavy rock. The constantly flowing, near-freezing water would act as a natural coolant, keeping the contents many degrees cooler than the ambient air temperature. This simple system could extend the life of fresh food by several precious days, long enough to enjoy a few proper meals before having to resort once more to salt pork and hardtack. For those in more established camps, another solution was to dig a root cellar or a cold storage pit. This involved excavating a deep hole in the ground, often lining it with rocks or wood to prevent cave-ins. Because the earth below a certain depth maintains a relatively constant and cool temperature year-round, this underground chamber became a natural icebox. Here, a miner could store not just root vegetables like potatoes or turnips, but also his precious crock of sourdough starter, protecting the living culture from freezing in the winter and from the oppressive heat of the summer. These cellars were a sign of a certain level of permanence and foresight, a declaration that the occupant planned to stay for a while. Each of these techniques, salting, smoking, drying, and cool storage, represented a different strand in the web of survival. They were not foolproof. A sudden warm spell could spoil meat in a stream-cooled pail. Excessive humidity could cause mold to form on drying jerky, but together, they formed a critical body of knowledge. This wasn't just about making food last. It was about wresting a measure of control from a chaotic environment, about using wisdom and effort to build a small buffer against the ever-present threat of hunger. In a land where a single moment of carelessness could mean the loss of a week's worth of provisions, these practical skills were as valuable as any map to a hidden gold vein. Yet for all the deprivation and desperation within the mining camps, this colossal, concentrated demand for food was sending shockwaves through the entire region, setting in motion an economic transformation that would prove far more permanent than any gold vein. The very same astronomical prices that were a source of misery for the individual miner were a flashing beacon of opportunity for a different kind of fortune seeker. While one man stared into an empty bean pot, another was looking at the vast, fertile valleys of California and seeing a different kind of green gold. This was the birth of California's agricultural empire, an industry forged not in the rocky riverbeds, but in the desperate, empty stomachs of the 49ers. The logic was simple and irresistible. If a single potato could be sold for $1 in the diggings, then the person who could grow potatoes by the ton would become unimaginably wealthy. A new wave of entrepreneurs arrived, but they didn't bring pans and shovels. They brought plows and seeds. They saw that the real money wasn't necessarily in finding gold, but in feeding the people who were obsessed with finding it. These agricultural pioneers quickly commandeered the Great Central Valley, a massive, sun-drenched expanse of incredibly rich alluvial soil, and began planting on a scale previously unseen in the American West. They weren't setting up small family homesteads for subsistence. They were creating massive commercial enterprises from day one, industrial farms designed to do one thing: produce calories and cash crops as efficiently as possible to satiate the unending hunger of the mining regions. Vast fields of wheat soon waved where herds of Chile elk had once grazed, their grain destined to be milled into flour for the countless loaves of bread consumed daily. Immense potato patches were cultivated, each harvested spud representing a day's wage for a miner and a handsome profit for the grower. But it wasn't just the staples. Recognizing the specific, vitamin-starved needs of the population, these farmers also planted orchards and vegetable gardens. They grew onions and cabbages in quantities that would have seemed absurd back east, knowing that each shipment could help stave off the scurvy that plagued the camps and would be purchased at any price. The landscape itself began to change, morphing from a wild, natural state into a geometric patchwork of cultivated land, all driven by the economic engine of the gold rush. This agricultural boom required a parallel revolution in transportation and infrastructure. To get these monumental harvests from the valley floors up into the rugged Sierra foothills, an entire industry of teamsters and freight companies emerged. Long wagon trains, pulled by teams of 20 oxen or more, became a common sight on the treacherous mountain trails, their beds piled high with sacks of flour, barrels of potatoes, and crates of produce. These were the true lifelines of the mining camps, and the men who drove these wagons were the unsung heroes of California's development, battling mud, dust, and gravity to connect the source of the food with the source of the demand. The prices remained high, but the very existence of this steady supply began to stabilize the volatile food market, ensuring that even if a miner had to pay a fortune, there was at least something available to buy. This new agricultural reality also reshaped the social and economic fabric of the state. It created a new class of wealthy landowning farmers and a vast demand for farm labor, drawing in workers from across the globe and laying the early groundwork for California's diverse population. The capital generated from selling food to miners was then reinvested into the land, funding irrigation systems, better equipment, and more acreage, creating a virtuous cycle of growth and consolidation. The lessons learned in feeding the gold rush lessons in large-scale production, supply chain management, and market-driven cultivation became the bedrock of California's future. The frantic, short-term need to stop a miner's hunger had, almost accidentally, planted the seeds for a lasting agricultural powerhouse. The picks and shovels are now museum pieces, and the mines are largely silent, but the farms that grew to feed them have endured, their output now feeding not just a state, but a nation and the world. The most lasting treasure to come from the California gold rush, therefore, wasn't the metal pulled from the streams, but the profound and permanent transformation of the land itself, a legacy of abundance born from a time of desperate want. While the staples of beans, pork, and hardtack formed the monotonous baseline of the miner's diet, a remarkable culinary revolution was quietly unfolding in the foothills, one that would forever change the flavor of the American West. The California gold rush was not merely a domestic migration, it was a global magnet, pulling tens of thousands of hopefuls from every corner of the world. They arrived not as a monolithic wave of prospectors, but as distinct communities, each bringing their own rich food traditions, agricultural knowledge, and entrepreneurial spirit. In stark contrast to the Anglo-American reliance on preserved goods, these ethnic enclaves cultivated, foraged, and cooked with a sophistication that offered a vibrant, flavorful, and often healthier alternative to the mainstream fare. This created a nascent culinary melting pot in the most unlikely of places, where the desperate search for gold inadvertently planted the seeds of a diverse American food culture. The most profound and influential of these contributions came from Chinese immigrants, who began arriving in large numbers in the early 1850s. They were often met with suspicion and prejudice, forced to work claims that others had abandoned. Yet, in the face of this hostility, they demonstrated an agricultural and commercial genius that would become their lasting legacy. While other miners saw the land only for the minerals buried beneath it, the Chinese saw the potential in the soil itself. They noticed that certain patches of land, deemed worthless for mining, were in fact incredibly fertile. With meticulous care and ancient techniques, they began cultivating tiny, intensively farmed garden plots. Using irrigation methods they had perfected over centuries, they coaxed an astonishing variety of vegetables from the California earth: bok choy, melons, scallions, snow peas, and a wide array of leafy greens. These were not just crops, they were a form of edible medicine, packed with the very vitamins that could prevent the scurvy crippling so many other miners. They established intricate and highly efficient supply chains, with teams of men carrying fresh produce in baskets suspended on poles across their shoulders, walking for miles to sell their harvests directly to mining camps. The sight of these vegetable vendors became a common one, and even the most prejudiced miners, desperate for a taste of something fresh, would grudgingly become customers. This was a quiet, agricultural conquest that proved, in many ways, more sustainable and ultimately more lucrative than the chaotic scramble for gold. Beyond their farming, the Chinese also introduced the concept of the public restaurant to the mining frontier. In camps like Weaverville and Auburn, they established bustling eateries that served as community hubs. For a reasonable price, a miner, regardless of his origin, could sit down to a hot, flavorful meal that was a world away from his own bland cooking. These restaurants served dishes like wonton soup, stir-fried vegetables with meat, and steaming bowls of rice. For many weary prospectors, this was their first encounter with soy sauce, ginger, and garlic, flavor profiles that were simultaneously exotic and deeply satisfying. The Chinese restaurant offered more than just nutrition. It provided a semblance of civility, a place to sit at a table and be served a well-prepared meal, a small but profound comfort in a harsh and lonely land. Their success demonstrated a powerful economic truth. In a gold rush, there is often more reliable fortune in feeding the dreamers than in dreaming itself. From the south came another vital culinary influence, carried north by Mexican miners, or buscadores de oro, who were among the very first to rush to the Sierra Nevada after the discovery at Sutter's Mill. For them, this was not a foreign land, but the northern frontier of their own recently ceded territory, and they arrived with a deeply ingrained food culture perfectly suited to the demands of a mobile, outdoor life. The cornerstone of this cuisine was the tortilla, a simple, durable flatbread made from ground maize. Unlike the finicky sourdough starter that required constant care, tortillas could be made quickly from masa flour, cooked on a simple griddle, and eaten with virtually anything. They were the perfect edible utensil, used to scoop up beans, wrap around meat, or simply eaten as a filling bread. This introduced a new texture and flavor to the campfire repertoire, a soft, pliable alternative to the rock-hard jawbreaker that was hardtack. Even more transformative was the Mexican introduction of chili peppers. These dried or fresh pods added a dimension of heat and complexity that was completely absent from the bland, salty miner's diet. A single chili could transform a pot of boring beans into a vibrant, spicy dish. Miners learned to use chilies not just for flavor, but also as a way to mask the taste of meat that was beginning to turn, a practical preservation trick in a world without refrigeration. the Mexican method of slow-cooking tough cuts of meat with chilies and spices in a stew, what we would recognize today as an early form of chili con carne, was adopted by cooks of all backgrounds. It was a way to make the stringy, gamey meat of jackrabbit or the ubiquitous salt pork more palatable and digestible. Furthermore, Mexican vaqueros, or cowboys, who managed the cattle herds that supplied the camps, were masters of meat preservation through jerking, a technique they perfected and shared. The term jerky itself is an anglicization of the Spanish charqui, for this dried, salted meat. Their expertise in this area provided a reliable, portable protein source that was superior in flavor to the standard salt pork. The cultural exchange wasn't always seamless, but over campfires and in shared dining halls, tastes and techniques intermingled. An Anglo miner might find himself adding a chili to his bean pot, or a German immigrant might use a tortilla to hold his sausage. The Mexican culinary contribution was one of practicality and potent flavor, enriching the miner's menu with ingredients and methods that were not just sustaining, but genuinely enjoyable, proving that even in the pursuit of wealth, the human desire for good food could not be suppressed. This global convergence created a unique culinary microcosm, where a single mining camp could host a staggering diversity of foodways. Chilean immigrants brought their recipes for empanadas, savory pasties filled with meat and vegetables that were a perfect, self-contained meal for a miner on the move. French chefs, drawn by the chance to cook for the newly wealthy, opened sophisticated restaurants in San Francisco and Sacramento, introducing techniques and sauces that raised the standard of what constituted a fine meal. Italian farmers found their niche in the fertile valleys, establishing vineyards and market gardens that would later become the foundation of the state's wine and produce industries. Even the Cornish miners from England, known as Cousin Jacks, brought their pasty-making tradition, a hearty pastry envelope filled with meat and root vegetables that was designed to stay warm for hours deep in a mine. The interaction between these groups was not always a peaceful fusion. Prejudice and cultural barriers were high. Yet, the marketplace and the universal imperative of hunger had a way of breaking down these walls. A Chinese vegetable vendor didn't need to speak fluent English to sell a basket of fresh greens to an Irish miner. The quality of the produce spoke for itself. A Mexican cook didn't need a formal agreement to have his spicy stew adopted by a group of hungry Germans. The aroma was persuasion enough. These ethnic enclaves became vital commercial and cultural centers within the booming camps. Their restaurants, food stalls, and gardens were not just places of business. They were bastions of identity, where immigrants could find the familiar tastes of home and maintain a connection to the world they had left behind. For the broader population of miners, these establishments offered a culinary education and a delicious escape from their own limited cooking. They were living proof that there was more than one way to solve the problem of hunger, and that the solution could be found not just in a sack of flour, but in a dried chili, a head of bok choy, or a perfectly folded empanada. This rich tapestry of food traditions, woven together in the crucible of the gold camps, did more than just feed the 49ers. It laid the foundational flavors for modern California cuisine, creating a diverse and adventurous palate that would long outlast the gold fever that brought it all together. But the campfire could only provide so much comfort, and the solitary act of eating from a single pot eventually gave way to a new, revolutionary concept in the mining districts: the communal table. As successful camps swelled into permanent towns with names like Sonora, Nevada City, and Downeyville, the very definition of a meal began to transform. The first step in this evolution was often the humble boarding house. For a miner tired of sleeping in a damp tent and cooking his own meals, these establishments offered a lifeline to a more orderly existence. For a fixed weekly rate, a boarding house would provide a cot in a shared dormitory and, most importantly, a seat at a long table for 2 or 3 meals a day. The fare was typically simple, hearty, and served family style in massive quantities to fuel a hard-working clientele. You would not find a printed menu. You ate what the landlady or cook had prepared that day, which was usually a rotation of the same staples: a thick stew, a roast of beef or pork, potatoes, beans, and fresh baked bread if you were lucky. While the food itself might not have been dramatically different from what a miner could make himself, the experience was worlds apart. It was a hot meal that required no labor on his part, served on a proper plate, in a room with a roof, surrounded by the buzz of conversation. This was no longer just about filling a stomach. It was about purchasing a slice of domestic normalcy, a few moments of feeling like a civilized human being rather than a grubby prospector. From these basic boarding houses sprouted a more diverse and ambitious culinary landscape, the true boomtown restaurant. These establishments varied wildly in quality and ambition, reflecting the bizarre economic stratification of the gold rush itself. On one end of the spectrum was the simple hash house or beanery. These were no-frills cafes that served cheap, fast meals to miners in a hurry. The atmosphere was utilitarian, a long counter with stools, a few rough tables, and the constant clatter of tin plates and cups. The food was basic and predictable: a slab of salt pork, a whack of sourdough bread, and a draw of coffee, all for a fixed, relatively low price. Efficiency was the priority, turning over customers quickly to maximize profit. Yet, even these humble spots represented a major social shift. They were some of the first public spaces where a miner could sit down and eat a meal he hadn't cooked himself, surrounded by strangers, absorbing the news and gossip of the town. They were the fast food joints of their day, democratizing the restaurant experience for the masses of single men who had no home to go to. At the opposite extreme were the fine dining palaces that catered to the newly minted elite. In cities like San Francisco and Sacramento, and even in wealthier mining towns, restaurants emerged that sought to rival the finest establishments in New York or Paris. These were places of astonishing opulence, with mirrored walls, crystal chandeliers, imported linen tablecloths, and polished silverware. Their most powerful symbol of sophistication was the printed menu, a lengthy document that offered a dizzying array of choices, a stark contrast to the single pot of the campfire. A miner who had struck it rich could peruse a menu offering oysters on the half shell, green turtle soup, roasted quail, French pastries, and a selection of wines from Europe. The waitstaff was professional, the service was formal, and the entire experience was designed to be a performance of wealth and refinement. Dining in such a place was a public declaration that one had transcended the grubby world of the diggings and had arrived as a gentleman. The food itself was often prepared by trained French chefs who had been lured west by the promise of high wages from a clientele with more money than sense. These restaurants were not about sustenance, they were about status, a ritualistic consumption meant to erase the memory of 1,000 meals of hardtack and beans. This explosion of dining options created a new social ecosystem and a new form of commerce. The restaurant became a central hub for business, politics, and social life. Deals over mining claims were struck over a steak and a bottle of claret. Politicians courted voters in busy dining rooms. Reporters gathered in restaurants to pick up the latest rumors. For the many men living far from their families, these eateries also served as a surrogate home, a place of warmth and light where they could combat the profound loneliness of frontier life. The very existence of a restaurant, from the simplest beanery to the most extravagant fine dining establishment, signaled that a settlement was maturing. It meant that there were enough people with enough disposable income to support a service-based economy beyond bare necessities. It marked the transition from a chaotic camp of individuals focused solely on survival to a functioning town with a social and commercial infrastructure. The journey from a solitary campfire meal to a seat in a bustling restaurant was, in a very real sense, the journey of the gold rush itself, a slow, hard-fought crawl from mere existence toward something that resembled a society. So, what did miners actually eat in the gold rush? The answer is far more than a simple list of ingredients. It is a profound story of human grit, raw desperation, and breathtaking ingenuity. Their diet was a world away from the romanticized campfire feast we might imagine. It was, for the overwhelming majority, a monotonous, soul-crushing, an often dangerously unhealthy daily struggle for the most basic of necessities, calories. It was hardtack that could break a tooth, salt pork that had to be boiled for hours just to be edible, and a single, shared pot of beans that defined weeks on end. This was a life where a fresh onion was a luxury worth a day's wage, and a simple can of peaches represented a triumph of modern technology over the relentless decay of the frontier. Yet, from this crucible of hardship, something remarkable emerged. The sheer, concentrated need of hundreds of thousands of hungry people became a powerful economic and cultural engine. It gave birth to enduring dishes like the extravagant Hangtown Fry, a symbol of sudden wealth, and the humble, life-sustaining sourdough starter, a symbol of perseverance. It forced the rapid creation of entirely new industries, transforming the fertile valleys of California into an agricultural powerhouse almost overnight to feed the relentless demand from the hills. The frantic search for food laid the foundations for supply chains, restaurants, and a diverse culinary landscape shaped by global influences from Chinese vegetable growers to Mexican buscadores de oro. This culinary legacy, forged in hunger, did more than just fill stomachs. It helped define the very identity of California, setting it on a path to becoming the nation's breadbasket. The story of the miner's plate is a powerful and humbling reminder that behind every grand historic hunt for treasure, behind every swing of the pickaxe and every panning of a river, there was a more fundamental, more human, and often more desperate hunt: the daily, unending search for a piece of bread, a warm meal, and the simple strength to see another day.